By 5 May, the ranks of DesRon 53 had been mostly filled. 8 of the 9 new Fletchers were present and ready for duty. Destroyer Division 105 was fully complemented and was made up of the USS Callahan, DD-688, the USS Halsey Powell, DD-686, the USS Allman, DD-687, USS Benham, DD-796, and the USS Cushing, DD-797. Destroyer Division 106 had 3 of her 4 vessels. Present and available for duty were the USS Tinian, DD-540, USS Yarnell, DD-541, and USS Stockham, DD-683. The USS Wedderburn, DD-684, would eventually complete the unit, but would not arrive until the following month on 27 June 1944. From this point on, DesRon 53 would no longer be escorting oilers and freighters behind the lines. The squadron was now part of the fleet that was aggressively attacking Japanese bases throughout the Western Pacific, and eventually would be attacking Japan itself. Halsey Powell would remain in Pearl Harbor until 10 May. The time was spent swapping out old Mark 11 torpedoes for newer Mark 15s, replenishing stocks of ammunition, and of course, spending time on shore leave, giving the crew an opportunity to let off steam and explore Oahu. On Thursday, 11 May, the ship was underway at 0630, heading out for a day of drill and practice. Clearing the harbor, a full-power run was conducted, taking the ship up to 36 knots and fully exercising the boilers, engines, and equipment. When done, they met up with USS Newcomb, another Fletcher-class destroyer from DesRon 56. The 2 vessels completed gun calibration, then practiced firing special airburst anti-aircraft rounds, returning to Pearl Harbor for the night. 3 days later, on Sunday morning, 14 May, DD-686 left Pearl Harbor to meet the other units of the Saipan invasion force for 2 weeks of pre-invasion maneuvers. The crew was trained on, among other things, directed shore bombardment, close fire support, anti-submarine screening, torpedo firing exercises, and fighter direction exercises, to name a few. On 26 May, DD-686 returned to Pearl Harbor to get her No. 4 gun housing repaired. She spent the day in the Navy Yard, and by the next morning, the entire housing had been replaced and the gun was back in action. The morning of Tuesday, 30 May 1944, Halsey Powell was underway out of Pearl Harbor. Task Group 52.16 was forming up south of Oahu. By 1600, the group was moving westward. DD-686 was one of 11 destroyers screening Transport Division 10, 18, and 28, as well as the USS White Plains and Kalinin Bay, 2 Casablanca-class escort carriers, all going to Eniwetok. Initially, the voyage was uneventful. Then, at 22:20 on Saturday night, 3 June, the USS Coney reported a sound contact bearing 245 degrees, distance 1,000 yards. The entire formation executed an emergency turn to port. Coney remained behind to pursue the contact. The group experienced several alarms along the route, but no real threats. On 6 June, while still en route to Eniwetok, half a world away, 100,000 Allied troops began to storm ashore along the beaches of Normandy. The Allied invasion of Europe had begun. Yells and cheers erupted throughout the fleet, and the GQ and fire alarms were all going off. The group arrived at Eniwetok on 9 June. The destroyers formed a semicircular anti-submarine screen to cover the transports, APDs, and carriers as they entered the atoll. By 1000, Halsey Powell was resting in berth 211 in the southern anchorage. The group took on fuel and supplies before the final push to Saipan. On Sunday morning, 11 June 1944, Task Force 53 was on the move. Destination, the island of Saipan to support the invasion. The Halsey Powell and the other 10 destroyers screened the group during the 1,500-mile voyage. Every mile they sailed was a mile deeper into enemy territory. Wednesday, 14 June, the USS Robinson had an underwater contact at 2050. The formation executed an emergency 50-degree turn to port. The USS Coney and Robinson proceeded to attack, with the Robinson eventually reporting a diesel oil slick and odor on the surface, but a kill could not be confirmed. (15 June 1944, Thursday, was the invasion of Saipan. American forces would be landing on the west shore of the island to attack and destroy the Japanese occupiers. The day would be Halsey Powell's trial by fire. Before dawn, DD-686 joined Fire Support Group 52.17.3. She was the northernmost ship in a line of 11 that paralleled the shore about a mile west of Saipan. At 0811, the entire line commenced shore bombardment, covering the invasion force, raining shells down on the Japanese. A ceasefire was called just before 0900 as landing craft and amphibious vehicles approached the shoreline. By 1100, wounded were beginning to return from the beaches. Halsey Powell received 4 Marines in need of first aid: Corporal M.E. Riley, Private First Class J.T. Aldama, Private First Class W.C. Cannon, and Private First Class A.N. Hornberger. Several men were seen treading water nearby. The ship's whaleboat was sent and rescued 4 struggling Marines. Not long thereafter, Fire Control Man Second Class Jim Little was up in the Mark 37 Fire Control Director looking through the 12X optical rangefinder when he spotted an enemy vessel exiting Tenepeg Harbor northeast of the ship. He could clearly see Japanese sailors loading a large gun on her forecastle. Little dialed in the vessel's range, bearing, and estimated speed and sent the information down to the fire control computer. The 5-inch battery pointed at the vessel and fired. When the smoke cleared, Little could see that the enemy gun mount had been destroyed, and the Japanese sailors lay dead or dying around the mount. Several more salvos and the ship went to the bottom. Next, Fire Control Man Little spotted a small cargo ship coming out of Garapan Harbor northeast of DD-686. He sent the data downstairs to plot. A moment later, another 5-inch salvo set the vessel ablaze and eventually to the bottom. Machine gun fire raked the ship from time to time during the day, pinging off the hull and superstructure, sending the crew ducking for cover. Several enemy shells splashed astern, raising geysers of spray and causing the crew to become concerned that the Japanese were zeroing in on their position. Whenever she could, Halsey Powell retaliated with her 5-inch guns when enemy batteries could be spotted. At 15:36, the 40mm gun crews opened up on 2 Japanese aircraft that were chasing an American Kingfisher. The little Kingfisher caught fire, landed nearby in the water, and promptly sank. Radio man J.R. Gettle was pulled from the water with a wound to his right leg. That afternoon, the ship's gun crews were kept busy. They sank 2 enemy landing craft and an enemy lifeboat that was adrift. They also opened up on enemy planes that made approaches on the ship, all of which were driven off by intensive anti-aircraft fire from the Halsey Powell and the other ships in the firing line. By 2000, trained Marine spotters ashore were in radio communication with the ship's gun crews, and the 5-inch guns began delivering called fire on Japanese positions. By the end of the day, the ship had fired 986 5-inch AAC rounds, 12 white phosphorus rounds, 53 star shells, and nearly 1,000 40mm rounds. Throughout the night and into the next day, gunners worked with spotters on shore, providing night illumination fire and directed bombardment of enemy positions. When the sun came up on 16 June, DD-686 met up with an LST to replenish her ammunition stores. She fired another 500 shells that afternoon, and another 600 by midday on Saturday the 17th before a ceasefire was finally called. By Wednesday, 21 June, the surface forces had pushed the Japanese back, and Saipan Harbor was deemed safe. Ships of the task force began to drop anchor in the harbor, while the destroyers screened seaside for submarines that might lurk offshore, hoping for an easy score. 22 June began a month-long period of duty that centered around Saipan and the island of Tinian that was 4 miles south. Halsey Powell's duties rotated between patrolling Saipan Harbor, screening task groups as they approached and retired from the area, anti-submarine patrols, providing shore bombardment and night illumination missions, and night radar picket duty, to name a few. By 09 July 1944, organized resistance on Saipan had ceased, and the island was squarely in the hands of the Americans. While patrolling the next day, Halsey Powell came upon numerous bodies floating in the water. They were civilians, residents of the island that committed suicide rather than be captured by the Americans. On 24 July 1944, the invasion of Tinian commenced. Halsey Powell's part on the first day of the operation was mainly providing shore bombardment and fire support to ground forces as they went ashore and fought their way inland. The following week was similar to the last month: shore bombardment, night illumination missions, anti-submarine patrols, and the like. After a week of fighting, the island was in American hands. Organized resistance on Tinian Island ended on 01 August. With the Japanese resistance eliminated on both Saipan and Tinian, duties reverted to mainly anti-submarine patrols around the islands. Thursday, 3 August, the Halsey Powell and other destroyers fueled from USS Patuxent while underway, topping off their tanks. 08 August was the last day DD-686 would patrol Saipan and Tinian. It had been 55 days since the first shots were fired as the invasion of Saipan began. The crew had passed their trial by fire and had proved their mettle. With the arrival of Wednesday, 9 August, Task Unit 51.19.2, consisting of destroyers Halsey Powell, Mungford, Patterson, Pritchett, Stockham, and Yarnell, were repositioning 135 miles southwest to the island of Guam. Ground forces had already invaded Guam several weeks earlier on 21 July. When the destroyers arrived on 10 August, all organized resistance on the island had ended. The group would spend the following week with duties like moving mail between ships, routine anti-submarine patrols, and night radar picket duty near Guam. Thursday, 17 August 1944, brought an end to DD-686's patrols around Guam. Orders were received to rendezvous with Task Unit 53.18.9, and she did so at sundown. When all the ships were present, the group set course for Eniwetok, 1,200 miles southeast, speed 12.5 knots. The trip would take 5 days. During the voyage, sound contacts were made several times, throwing several scares into the group. All proved to be false alarms or non-sub in origin. On Monday, 21 August, lookouts spotted a distant shell burst in the sky. Bearing 346 degrees, distance 20 miles. No surface or air contacts were observed on any of the radar screens, leaving the crew scratching their heads and chalking it up as being one of those unexplained mysteries of war. The group reached Eniwetok on the morning of 22 August without experiencing any real threats. By late August 1944, DesRon 53 was a fully complemented fighting unit with the arrival of the USS Wedderburn 2 months earlier in June. For the most part, these 9 Fletcher-class destroyers would operate as a unit for the remainder of the war. For now, DesRon 53 was assigned to Admiral Mitcher's Fast Carrier Task Force, more commonly known as simply Task Force 38. On Tuesday morning, 29 August, DesRon 53 was attached to Task Unit 38.2.3, the destroyer screen of Task Group 38.2. The squadron sailed out of Eniwetok and sortied with its group that was forming up outside the atoll. The group was centered around the aircraft carriers USS Intrepid, Bunker Hill, and USS Hancock, all Essex-class fleet carriers. The task group also included 2 lightweight jeep carriers, the USS Cabot and the USS Independence. Also part of the group were several battleships, cruisers, and of course, DD-686 and another 17 destroyers from DesRon 52 and 53. Once assembled, the group set a course south, with the USS Bunker Hill acting as guide. Destination was the island of Palau. When the task group crossed the Equator on 01 September, also known as the realm of King Neptune, skullduggery was afoot aboard the ships of the fleet. Rebellious Pollywogs were aplenty aboard the Halsey Powell. They were rounded up and taught to properly respect the realm and authority of King Neptune. Hair and beards were chopped off, some heads were shaved. Then, plenty of grease and blue paint were liberally applied. Only when properly initiated as to the mysteries of the deep and successfully running the gauntlet to prove themselves worthy sailors were these lowly Pollywogs brought before King Neptune himself, who, if pleased, would proclaim them full-fledged shellbacks. Saturday, 2 September, it was time to get back to work. The fleet met up with a group of oilers. Lines were thrown between the vessels, fuel hoses were rigged, and the ships topped off their tanks. The task group neared the island of Palau late on 6 September. At sunrise the next morning, the carriers launched air attacks on the island's Japanese bases. The destroyers crisscrossed and circled the group, ever watchful for any signs of enemy submarines or aircraft. Launching air attacks continued the following day. When the last aircraft was recovered that afternoon, Task Group 38.2 turned toward the Philippines. By 9 September 1944, the group was east of the Philippines. The air groups began attacking, starting with the airfields near Mindanao. All the while, the Halsey Powell and her sister destroyers circled and protected the carriers. From 12 to 15 September, air groups struck positions on Visayas, Cebu, Negros, and Legazpi. The task group then retired east to refuel, returning on Monday, 18 September, to continue attacks on the island of Luzon for the next week. When the last aircraft was recovered on the afternoon of 24 September, the group turned east and headed for Saipan. On Thursday, 28 September 1944, Task Group 38.2 was in Garapan Harbor, Saipan, where they remained for the night. At sunrise, the 27 ships of Task Group 38.2 departed Saipan and set sail for the brand new U.S. Navy base that was taking shape in the Ulithi Atoll. After sailing 550 miles on 01 October 1944, the ships began entering the lagoon at Ulithi, while the destroyers screened seaside. By 1715, the Halsey Powell was anchored at berth 46 inside the atoll. Less than 2 weeks earlier, the U.S. Navy chose this atoll to be their base and staging area in the Western Pacific. The islands around the atoll were being transformed into bases. Service vessels like tenders, oilers, and floating dry docks were arriving by the hour, quickly transforming this quiet, isolated atoll into a major naval base. The Seabees were even busy turning the small island of Mogmog on the north side of the atoll into a sailor's R&R paradise. But patrols were needed to watch over the nearby seas and lagoon entrances. The crew of DD-686 would need to wait for another day to see what the Navy's idea of R&R looked like on Mogmog. On 3 October, weather conditions began to deteriorate. At 0400, Halsey Powell was patrolling north of Ulithi when Task Group 38.2 received orders to depart the atoll, proceed to sea, and sail clear of an approaching typhoon. DD-686 steamed to the rally location where the task group was already forming up. When assembled, the group spent the day doing their best to get out of the storm's path. Weather conditions continued to deteriorate, making for a rough ride for the lightweight destroyers. Overnight into 4 October, the storm threat subsided and weather conditions improved. By sunrise, the task group began to return to the base at Ulithi. By 1300, the crew of the Halsey Powell let go of the anchor, securing the ship for the afternoon in the Ulithi anchorage. Maybe now the crew would have time to check out the Navy's new R&R facilities on Mogmog.